Hello there from India. So this is Abhivardhan from ISAIL, and we are up there for the first episode of the second season of AI Now. And we have one of the greatest personalities in this field, particularly who is debunking the AI hypes. And I believe that this is one of the most important problems which is emerging even in the field of AI and law and policy, because what happens is that due to the very issue and the very institutionalization of these hypes. So I would be more than happy to welcome Dr. Jeffrey Funk from Singapore. He's a technology consultant. He has been a professor, and if you read his articles, if you read his works on hype and how innovation is actually being affected, how marketing is also affecting the way innovation works, this would something be of much purpose, and I believe it could also become an area of research for understanding how to combat it at the end of the day. So sir, welcome to AI Now. I'm more than happy to have you on board, and let's begin with this. So for the sake of understanding, let's try to create some context out of it. So I'd like to understand the history of AI hype. Now, everybody understands what AI hype technically is, because AI hype is all about, like, okay, fine, there's one particular kind of technology which you're using, a product or service, but it doesn't mean that the product or service is going to deliver exactly what you're trying to profess. It could fall short of what it actually does in terms of what is marketed. So, if we a little bit try to understand how the history of AI hype is, then maybe we can take the discussion forward. So, if you can, if you would like to elaborate about that.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Basically, hype is exaggeration. You're exaggerating something. You're saying that it's better than it really is. And the problem with doing that is that then you mislead people about how hard something is, mislead people as to what it can deliver. And then that causes you not to think as carefully as you should about the technology. So if you say that, oh, AI is so great, it's going to do all these things, it causes uh, it reduces the amount of time that people spend thinking about it. So somebody says, well, I think that's going to work. Maybe we should try something else. Maybe we should try a little different thing. No, no, no. This is going to be so easy. So the problem with hype is that it ends up reducing the amount of thought that people are putting into AI and how it can deliver better products and services.
That's quite interesting because even in general that happens. For example, I think it starts with bodies which who actually propose that, okay, fine, AI is going to be the future. It's going to help you everywhere, and it's going to be a kind of a savior and all of that. And that something is very weird because in general it depends on how much technologies work, their aesthetics and their pragmatic implications. Both of them matter a lot. So in that context, I think we should take the discussion by understanding how innovation has been affected. Now, in one of your very interesting pieces, you showed a graph about semiconductors and other form of technology resources, and you very rightly mentioned that innovation is slowing down. So, if you could elaborate about that with some examples, like why is it happening and what's the trend like? Yeah.
So you're actually asking why innovation is slowing down
Yes.
for AI or for technologies in general?
I believe for both. Let's start with technologies and then let's narrow it down to AI, I believe. Yes.
Uh, okay, well, a lot of economists have been finding over the last 20 to 50 years that the growth in productivity in America has been has slowed substantially. They have found that it costs more to maintain Moore's law. So to get uh, the same increase in the number of transistors per chip takes more money than it used to take. It takes more money to develop drugs than it used to take. It takes more money than it used to achieve the same level of improvements in crop yields, agricultural crop yields. Other researchers have found that it's taking that we're getting less revenues out of corporate research expenditures. So all of this research suggests that innovation is slowing, productivity is slowing, and trying to explain why that's happening is very difficult to do, but nevertheless provides a context for us to think about AI. So when people are talking about being very optimistic about AI, I immediately think, well, but innovation has been slowing lately. Why do we think suddenly that's going to change? Right? Why is that suddenly? And so the proponents of AI should be able to explain it, should be able to say something about, well, this is why we think that this productivity growth is going to accelerate through AI. And I don't think they've done a very good job. And instead, what has happened is that they've hyped a lot of these AI applications, such as AI for healthcare, AI for driverless vehicles, and they haven't really worked out that well.
Speaking of AI in healthcare, for example, we used to hear a lot of news that radiologists will be replaced, and this particular sort of tech, such as imaging software, that could also be put into use, and maybe it could be the next revolution in replacing human beings who are actually doctors, or particularly assets in the medical profession. So considering the trend, I think even Google tried to involve itself in healthcare and medical sciences to some extent. But I believe if we see Sundar Pichai's comments and even the recent comments by Google, they're not that much clear. Neither they are so much pumped up for this. So how do you see the hype in AI and healthcare likewise?
Well, healthcare has received a lot of attention from AI over the last 20 years. IBM has been in AI, I think, the longest of all big companies. Uh, and so a little bit of history. IBM developed Watson, and Watson won the game show Jeopardy. It won at chess back a number of years ago, 20 years ago or so. And then it thought, well, we're going to replace doctors. We're going to use Watson to become a doctor, an assistant for doctors. And so a lot of money was spent on that. There was a lot at the at a hospital in Texas, I think the Anderson Hospital, and for a number of years, people were very optimistic about it. But then by about 2015, 2016, reports started to come out that it wasn't doing that well. And very quickly after those reports came out, IBM said, well, it's not going to do that well. We're going to cut back on this. So then the story about AI in healthcare changed to imaging. Now, we would expect that AI would do well in imaging, because imaging it's all this data. It's not really the real world, right? It's all this data that's collected by a form of computer, either a CAT scanner or an MRI scanner. So it's computer data. So this should be easier for the computer to do than perhaps humans. It's not like the computer is trying to interpret the real world, the world that that humans are very good at interpreting. It's interpreting this computer data. And someone who is Jeffrey Hinton, who received the Turing Award a few years ago, he predicted in 2016 that all radiology jobs would be gone for 2021. And he said that we should stop training radiologists because all the jobs would be gone by 2021. And obviously that hasn't happened. And if you look at data for Europe, you'll see that the number of radiologists has been growing, has continued to grow since 2016. And it certainly looks like it will continue growing. There is a small number of AI being used in radiology now. I think, if I can recall the data, I think that 10% of radiology centers claim they're using AI as a practice, not as research, but as practice to interpret images. Only 10%. So here we are, 5 years after Jeffrey Hinton said this, and well, we're a long ways from being there, because just because a radiology center uses AI to interpret some images, that doesn't mean it's interpreting all images with that. So there's a long number of years before we're going to see lots of radiology center using AI, and before radiology is used for most image interpretation. And then we got more years after that before actually it replaces those radiologists. So this is a good example of an application that has been very overhyped by AI people.
Indeed. So let's get to some more illustrations. I think with respect to other sectors, because I think in healthcare also it is pretty understandable that the same trends come in. And I did read about the graphs that you mentioned regarding the claims made by Jeffrey Turing, particularly. So I think we need to see it. One thing which uh, Andrew Ng usually points out is that, he says that it's not just about healthcare, but there's a problem that, okay, fine, when you are developing something, you need to prove it's if it's working or not, and then after that, how production happens and so forth. So what we call, in simple terms, in phrase, if I would quote it, he says that it's something like a proof of concept to production gap. So how can you explain this phenomena or this anomaly which actually has become? Yeah.
Yeah, good question. Good follow-up to the radiology example, because uh, Andrew Ng, a very noted machine learning person, explains that what's going on in radiology very well. He basically says that when we collect data and tests from Stanford Hospital, uh, we can show the algorithms work very well. But when we take that same model to another hospital or another machine, it oftentimes doesn't work well. Now, the problem is that the data set has been you develop this algorithm on just one machine and one set of data, and now when you want to apply it outside that data set, well, perhaps that original data set wasn't big enough. So this is a very common problem in AI, in that you need a lot of data, and I think that people are underestimating how much data is needed, because you train these you find these algorithms, develop these algorithms based on a very limited amount of data, and then when you try to apply it to other data, it doesn't work. So this is this proof of concept to production gap that I think explains partly why radiology isn't doing well, but it's applicable almost every AI application. Oh, and one more thing on that. So a separate study concluded that a good problem is that you should estimate that for every $1 you spend developing an algorithm, you must spend $100 to deploy and support it. Now that's a very big multiplier, 100 to 1, right? So that deploying it, right, that's getting more data of data.
Okay. So I recently remember that there was a project or an initiative known as Starlink by Elon Musk, where he actually said that he would try to replace, uh, I believe, satellites with some sort of, I don't know, small towers or some plates like thing. I'm just saying in a very casual manner, but I think we understand what it is. And we saw that the efficacy of the particular product or whatever it is, that actually could not go so far. So, do we see the same trends here? Like, if we take the example of Starlink, I'm just curious to know. So, I put up something of a different technology, I understand, but just for the sake.
Well, yeah, Starlinks is very different from AI. It's a satellite service. So, uh, the internet broadband through fiber optics is a great technology, and it's spread very, very widely in the world. And it's particularly applicable in dense urban settings where you can connect people's homes, lots of homes, very cheaply with this fiber to the home. Now it gets harder when you're in rural areas. because now you might have to have 1 mile of fiber for one house, for one family. So clearly that's something expensive. That one family has to pay for this 1 mile of fiber, and if they put it underneath the ground, which they usually do, then you have to dig. So that costs a lot of money. So Musk has said, okay, we're going to use satellites, and satellites have gotten a lot cheaper over the last 50 years. They're quite small now. Cost of sending them into orbit is not so expensive. And so actually, it seems to be working to some extent quite well, but it's just not working as well as many people claim, because the problem is that you need a line of sight. So you can't have, and it's for some reason the satellites are low in the sky. So any trees, that blocks the line of sight. Any buildings, right? So obviously in an urban area, you're gonna have buildings, so it's not gonna work. But even in a rural setting, you've got trees, well, that becomes hard. They block it. There's also a latency issue, and so for some applications, the latency isn't short enough, because it's not as short as for broadband. So there are problems. It's also about consistency. So, a lot of times these promises are made. We see these promises made a lot in telecom, where they'll tell you, well, we're going to get these speeds, and we're going to get this latency, and we're going to get this and that, right? All technology, you get these promises, but then you find out that they're quoting you figures that are in ideal conditions, right? So some telecom figures for ideal conditions, speeds and things. There's and it could be satellite speeds, but it's certain ideal conditions, right? That's very similar to this AI case, where people come up with algorithms in this one condition, where it works on this one set of data, but then you try to apply it to another set of data and it doesn't work. So there's this problem always of people making promises based on a very limited set of data. In one case, oh, this is going to work so well, and see how well it works. But then you find out that when you try to apply it to other cases, well, it takes a lot more work. And this is, of course, a very old engineering problem, that something works well in the lab, but out in the real world, and you have to modify and you have to modify, and that's okay, right? It takes longer than you think, but we need to keep that in mind. It takes so longer than you think. We also need to be very careful and look at why it doesn't work as well in the field. Okay, there's these reasons. So does this mean that we're going to be able to get it to work in the next year or the next 5 years, or is it going to take 10 years, right? And good engineers don't hype things. Good engineers think, we got to think carefully about this. If we're going to make it work, we can't hype and exaggerate. We got to think very carefully about these problems and what it takes to solve.
Let's take the discussion forward through understanding algorithms and their use. So we see one thing, and I'm taking the context of how algorithms are used in social media, and I'm taking one example. We can also get to other examples as well, because I think this is also one of the most important examples. So what generally happens with algorithms is that whenever algorithms are used to restrict some form of speech or any particular activity per se, it is generally assumed that there are certain particular guidelines which are followed. Now, even in America, if I'm correct, I may be wrong, but if I'm correct, I think even the hate speech guidelines or any particular regulation guidelines, based on community standards by YouTube or any such prominent social media company, are based on European standards. Now, one thing is that since they're based on the such standards, one thing with regards to implementation, which actually is a problem, and I think we can discuss this further, is that such algorithms do tend to block or do tend to moderate particular sort of forms of speech and so forth. But I think in the long run, it is kind of censoring, because uh, I think lack of transparency is obviously there. But I think with the beyond lack of transparency, I think the issue is that it does not technically understand how to do it in that particular way. So if you can just elaborate about that, maybe we can take other examples in algorithms, and I would love to do that. But yeah.
Yeah, well, now you're getting outside my expertise and talking about the impact of these algorithms on identifying hate speech, or it's very hard to do. It's very hard to do, and AI hasn't done that well so far, and humans don't even do that well. Humans do that well, so I think it's going to be very hard to do this. I know you have to think back to the way things used to be, and the way things used to be is there was a small number of media outlets, right? So in America, we had three big uh, television stations, and they followed these rules of the government, and in most countries this way. They had a limited number of media outlets, and the internet opened that all up so that everybody could talk. And there's great things about that. But now people are concerned about, well, people saying too many things on social media, too many things that are dangerous, that upset people, that cause conflicts. Um, so this is a potential application for AI, but I think it's very hard, because when humans can't even do something, when humans aren't very good at this interpretation, well, AI is probably not going to be very good at it either.
Really happy to know that. So let's understand the use of GPT-3, one technology by OpenAI. Now, such language models, which are obviously, I believe, based on NLP or NLU, if I'm correct, one of them may be, they are called as stochastic parrots. So, if you can elaborate about how GPT-3 works and what are particular flaws, and if you can elaborate about this issue of stochastic parrots. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm not an expert on how GPT-3 works, but for me, I hear about GPT-3 and a number of concerns immediately come out. Uh, first of all, people a lot of times they hear about GPT-3, and the first thing they think is, "Wow, that's so great, that's so cool. Look at what it's able to do." Right? And it's the same thing with self-driving vehicles, right? Look at how it work, man. That's amazing. Those engineers are incredible, and yeah, they are incredible. But to me, it's all about economic benefits, right? That's what we want. That's what we want from these technologies. Yeah, from an engineering standpoint, I was trained as an engineer and a physicist. So to me, when something works real well, I want to say, "Oh, that's cool. That's really cool." But at the same time, I know that, well, that's not what we're paying for. We're not paying for coolness. We're paying for something that provides some economic benefits. So for GPT-3, I ask, well, what is it able to do? What can it do for us, right? And there's some simple things that it could do, like it could create a lot of social media posts. Now, is that good? Do we need more social media posts? Then you might say, well, it could write our students, it could write our kids' reports for school. Well, we don't really want that. We want our kids to write their own reports, their own papers, so that they can learn how to write. They can learn how to think. So that's not a very good application for GPT-3. Okay, then you say, well, what if they could write some really great books? Well, now we're talking about a very big challenge to have AI write something that's better than humans could write. Write a better novel, write a science paper. All right. So to me, this is really the big question: is what can it do that's going to make our life better? It's cool, but when we look at how well it works, right, it gives a lot of nonsensical answers and things, and unless GPT-3 works really even better than 100%, it has to work as well as humans, better than humans, for it to really add value. And so that's a very hard application for AI to provide economic benefits, in my opinion.
That's great. So maybe we will go ahead and discuss more about augmentation and its cycle which could develop. But one question as a follow up to it, since we are discussing algorithms, do we see that since we know that it's more about applying Moore's law everywhere and kind of using marketing in most of these things, is there a cultural imperative to it that we see generally among companies across the world? I generally see it companies in the United States doing it a lot. I don't see much
Yeah.
in Europe. I don't know. I may be wrong. We are following the same trends in India. I believe, but again, I think India is still emerging, and its AI sector and analytics has a lot to go. But still, I think India has got a lot of relations with the United States commercially. So in that sense, we see Americans a lot in that sense. So, is there a cultural perspective to it? Because I believe that there is a particular aspect to it. Sometimes even international bodies like the UN are also involved indirectly. So, if you can explain a little bit about the cultural aspects of it. Yeah.
Well, I assume you're asking about the cultural aspects of hype and how we describe the benefits of new technology and how we try to sell something to people. And obviously there is a lot of culture to this in terms of using analogies to try to sell something. And and the Moore's law for everything, right? So this is you know this kind of analogy where we've seen Moore's law enable so many great technologies in America, from all these better computers, all these better mobile phones, video games, and so on. And so and we all know that doubles the number of transistors per chip every 18 months, 24 months, whatever rule you want to use. And so we think, well, wouldn't that be great if we could, if that would happen for cars or houses or all kinds of other things? But the problem is it's harder, right? So a lot of people will say they know what Moore's law is because they know that it's the doubling of the transistors, number of transistors in a chip every year. But they don't understand how that's achieved. Engineers do, but a lot of other people don't. They don't realize that you have to make these transistors smaller every year. And now they're so small that it's hard to make them smaller, right? When you're talking about 10 nanometer transistors, something that's very, very small, something that has that's impacted by quantum effects, it's very hard to do. And it's a good selling point, but I think there's been a big slowdown in Moore's law, and it would be nice if we could get anywhere, close to that. If we can get a little close to that with AI, then it would be great. But so far we're not. But returning to your original point, yes, there is this culture in how you sell things, and how you make your promises, and the analogies you use.
I believe so. That's the case. So, let's then discuss about augmentation. So, what actually we have also seen, and I think you have also tried to emphasize upon that, is that augmentation is going to proceed forward, and it is actually becoming a future. You gave examples of robotic process automation, and obviously natural language processing is a part of augmentation. It is actually happening already. If we take any particular service or app for that matter, which is in concerned with NLP. um, yeah, maybe even in the case of analyzing terrorism, maybe such technologies could be used. So, if you can elaborate more about how this works, how augmentation is actually becoming a
Yeah.
very important industry, and but again, you said that it does not become a replacement. So, if that's the case, then why? I would be very bad.
Well, eventually it will replace, but it just takes a very long time. And so there was a number of original predictions, predictions that AI was just going to replace all these people. That it was going to. So we mentioned radiologists. That was one example, but there were other people making these claims for doctors, lawyers, accountants, and so on and so on. And there was there's been a lot in Europe of this, the rise of the robots. Um, I'm forgetting his name. Daniel Susskind wrote a book last year, which, like the rise of the robots, was either a finalist for the Financial Times Best Book of the Year or won the award. I don't remember which. But both books have made these outrageous claims that all these jobs are going to replace. We're all going to be out of work, and and the few people who are left who are working, well, they're going to make so much money that they're going to pay huge taxes, and we're all going to be able to survive on their work. And it's always been just an over exaggeration. This is a good example of the hype. And you can look back at history and see how technologies have diffused. So one of the easiest ways to do it is to think about agriculture. Most societies were very agricultural, and then became manufacturing and then services. And India's gone a little differently because it's kind of jumped to those IT services soon. But nevertheless, agriculture jobs, it wasn't as if they were replaced. These workers were replaced immediately. It took a long time because, see, at first, all of this equipment augmented the farmer. All of these tractors, all these combines, all this agricultural equipment augmented the farmer, made the farmer more productive. And it was just over many, many, many years that we needed less farmers. But there was a lot of jobs left for the remaining farmers. So it was a slow. And so now we've got the farmer sitting on a tractor for many years, but now that farmer is being replaced. So now the farmer may not have to go outside. They're inside the house working on using the computer. And this manufacturing, we had around the end of the 19th century in America, very high volume factories were being made, of which Henry factory was one of the most famous, where he created this assembly line. A great example of augmentation, where now we made these workers very productive because we brought them all the parts. So they put them together, right? They didn't have to walk around the factory searching for parts, things like that. They were right there on the assembly line, putting together the cars very quickly. We'd augmented them. Now, as time goes on, you replace someone with robots slowly but surely, and that has happened. But this replacement of factory workers by robots has taken a lot longer than people expected. I did my PhD at Carnegie Mellon 40 years ago on economic robots, and everybody was telling me that all of these things were going to happen much faster than they did. So now we get to AI, and I see the same story happening. I see that it's going to be a very slow process of augmentation, partly because we see that in IT. We see these tools that we've been given in offices, personal computers, word processing programs, Excel, spreadsheet programs, PowerPoint. Then we had the things provided by SAP in engineering requirements planning, material requirements planning, all of these customer relation management, right? All this enterprise software that made workers much more productive. And now we see robotic process automation and AI next steps. But just like enterprise software didn't replace workers really, there were a few that lost jobs, bookkeepers, data entry people. These people lost jobs. For the most part, they required workers to become more skilled at these computer systems. So now when you look around the world in very rich countries, what do people do? They work on a machine called a computer, right? That's all they do. They have this computer that enhances their productivity. And so I see AI as continuing that trend. So robotic process automation, doing very repetitive tasks so that workers can focus on more difficult tasks. And so companies are offering these kinds of this kind of software that enhances the productivity of the workers, that augments their skills. So UiPath and other companies are doing this. And one way that to look at what's going to happen in the future, you can envision these workers who are working on the computer, robotic process automation to run very repetitive tasks, and we have natural language program that's bringing them information, bringing these knowledge workers information. They're lawyers, they're accountants, they're doctors, they're researchers. They're bringing them lots of information. So they're filtering, right? Because we know there's so much information out there on the web. We spend a lot of time searching. But what if that search time reduced by using natural language processing? So it wouldn't make the decisions for us. It would just merely bring us the information that we think we need. So now instead of looking at, so now maybe it takes us 1/10 as much time to search for information as we did in the past. So I see that as kind of the way forward. Very slow, incremental, gradual approach. But nevertheless, a way forward. It will improve productivity. productivity, and I'm optimistic about it. But it'll take a long time before it replaces many workers. It'll replace some, right? It'll replace people who are doing very repetitive work, but it will make a lot of other workers it will enhance their skills, augment their skills. So I see a very positive way patient.
That's really interesting. So, considering that, I had actually something to ask as a follow up. Now, you actually cited a very interesting report in one of your works, and I actually was going through it, which was regarding ImageNet. So,
Yeah.
the very thing which was in that report was that the training time for a particular system, which is for standard images under ImageNet, which actually fell by 8 times, while their numbers of accelerators increased by 6.4 times, which means that 80% of improvements came from only more computing and only 20% from better algorithms. So we also hear this one thing that despite the hype which is being shared, the more we apply algorithms in the particular kind of systems, maybe the process could be more costly. So if you can elaborate on that.
Yeah. So there are improvements in training time and in training costs. But as you mentioned, what the studies find is that this is from the Stanford AI Index report. So Stanford University produced this. So uh, it seems that a lot of the reduction in training time is coming from just using more computers. And a lot of the training costs are falling, partly because the cost of computers were falling. So if there's a slowdown in Moore's law, then we may not see as many improvements in training time and training costs in the future as we've been seeing. So even though AI still hasn't diffused much, still hasn't had a big impact, it could be that things don't slow down, or things slow down even further. These improvements become slower, which of course would be devastating. We're waiting for something to happen, and now it may be that things are going to slow down even more. And if you look at supercomputers, you'll find that that's what people are finding. People are finding that the annual increases improvements in supercomputers since 2013 are much smaller than they were before 2013. So this study was done just independent of AI. It didn't have anything to do with AI. It was just supercomputer people looking at performance improvements and finding that things are slowing down. So that's another set of bad news that we have to deal with.
Interesting. So let us come with some concluding questions and then let's see how this proceeds. Um, there's a particular hype about the rise of artificial general intelligence, and people have been working on it for some time. They propose their own theories. Even in international affairs, they're saying that for short term, AGI is all about having more regulations and understanding self-regulation and disruption of economies, which technologies can do. However, depends on whatever the situation is, or maybe the hype as it is related to. So, how do you see the way AGI is growing, and obviously the hype around it and the practicality? And maybe we can go for some follow-ups there.
Well, as I've said throughout this interview, I look at the economic benefits. To me, that's a big thing, and that's all based on the applications that I see AI challenging. Uh, and I do that because it's available. Right? We have all this information available on AI applications because we've been trying to do it now pretty seriously for about 5 to 10 years. And so that gives us information about how well AI can do, how well it's doing, and then helps us think about how well it will do in the future. Um, Now, of course, another way to look at AI, which is very common among AI practitioners, is to look at the AI itself, to think about what its potential is based on the research that's being done, how it solves problems. Now, this way I'm not as good at because I'm not an AI expert. So I mostly looked at these applications saying, well, they're not doing so well, and here's the reasons, and what is it? And that tells us something about what will happen in the future. But yes, you're right. You can look at how well the AI research is progressing. And there's a lot written on this. And there are some people, of course, who are very optimistic, but there's a lot of people who aren't optimistic, who look at it and say, well, we're not really making a lot of progress. If we look at the GPT-3, and we see some fundamental problems that probably can't be overcome by the existing machine learning approaches. They look at in some of the radiology problems. They look at that. They look at self-driving and they say, well, some of these problems that are faced by cars, some of the mistakes they're making, cannot be solved by the existing approach. We have to have this general intelligence. Now, whether we can achieve that, it's hard to say. But and I would say that we'll probably get there. We'll probably slowly get there, but it's going to take a long time. And maybe there'll be a breakthrough, but it's probably going to take a long time, because when you look at technologies historically, these things take a long time. Any technology you want to choose, they take a long time. And so this is probably going to take a long time to go to general intelligence. And I'm sure we'll research continue on this, as it should, but it's probably going to take a long time. And so I don't see that happening really in the next 3 to 5 years, or even 5 to 10 years.
Great. So I have one final question in this interview, and that question is regarding the pandemic. So when we take the emergence of various waves of the COVID-19 pandemic, and I don't know when this pandemic will end technically. It may convert itself into an endemic. Things may slow down for the virus and all that. So when we take the COVID-19 pandemic in general, and I'm asking in the sense of like in connection with the role of technologies, I have only two questions here in parts. First is, are we expecting any particular influence of the pandemic's effects on human life, in the sense that they're going to affect the transformation of AI technology or any form of augmented technology? That is one part. And the last part in this question is that if yes or no, then how actually the hype has actually developed when it comes to this pandemic. So if you can answer.
Well, certainly the pandemic has forced people to work from home, to do things differently. So e-commerce is growing much faster than it did before the pandemic. A lot of cloud computing services are growing faster than before the pandemic. And so it's likely that certain aspects of AI, robots and things, because we're trying to reduce the amount of human interactions in a lot of cases. So it may increase the rate at which this is occurring, but again, you don't really hear about any big breakthroughs in the way things are being done. You hear a few more robots, a little more cloud computing, more Zoom, more video conferencing, less conferences, but no big breakthroughs. Now, of course, one thing that might happen is there'll be fewer business conferences in the future. So there'll be less travel by planes. So that would be lower expenditures by companies, a big reduction in expenditures. It'd also be a big reduction in greenhouse gases, because airplane travel, particularly going across the Atlantic or the Pacific, causes a lot of greenhouse gases. So if you have ever had checked how many greenhouse gases you emit by answering one of these questionnaires, you'll find that the biggest impact is how many times you fly across the Atlantic or Pacific. So this is huge. So this could be a big difference if we reduce the amount of travel. So that might be one big benefit. It also could be a big benefit if we don't have to commute as much. But I have a feeling that the productivity has slowed a bit because people aren't in the office. It may have increased in some ways because we're using more digital tools, but in other ways, not able to have that human interaction that's needed to actually come up with better ideas for digital transformation and implement them. So there will be some good things that come out of this. I hate to say that because it's the pandemic is horrible, and obviously, in India, it's extremely horrible. But we might, get some kind of new thing, new productivity tools emerge because of this.
Just to one final follow up to this. So I believe even AI technologies can cause much environmental damage. So how about that?
Well, yeah, as we were talking about earlier, the time and training costs and things. Right, a lot of that's greater use of computers. Right, so it's not just for AI; it's for all of the smartphones we use, computers we use, all those data centers. So the percentage of electricity that's devoted to digital has gone up a lot. I think it's in the U.S. it's like 10% now. So it used to be just mostly transportation, heating and cooling, things like that. But now all of this data, all these computers, these data centers are causing a lot of emissions. And apparently with AI, if you try to increase the accuracy on the ImageNet, so you mentioned ImageNet earlier. So ImageNet is this standard set of images that we test AI tools on to see if they're getting better, and we use to develop these algorithms. So what these AI researchers have found is that if you try to increase, for example, I think it was the accuracy of on ImageNet from 89.5% to 99.5%, you have this huge increase in training time that's needed, which results in huge costs. Just billions and billions. People use these huge numbers to describe how much costs are needed, how much time is needed, and then, of course, how much greenhouse gases are emitted because of this dramatic increase to achieve this last improvement in accuracy. But of course, we need that, right? If we're going to have AI compete with humans and be able to have driving as safe as human drivers, then we're going to have to be able to have very high accuracy. If we're going to replace radiologists, we're going to have very high accuracy for a lot of these applications. Not all applications, right? So my argument all along has been find the applications that don't require high accuracies. Those are the ones we can do first and more easily. But the ones that require higher accuracy, they're going to be harder to do. And one of the reasons is related to your question. It just requires so much more computing resources to go from 89.5% to 99.5%, according to this study.
Right. So it's been an honor to have you for this interview, sir. And I believe it's the end of the discussion. I believe maybe as things develop in AI hype, and I think it's becoming one of the important fields for even understanding how this industry develops for people. Even our organization is thinking to actually ask our research people who are in law to work on this, maybe to work on issues of liability, of course, wherever necessary, because we are also seeing a jump in AI resources in India. So maybe yes, it could be a field of much considerations. So thank you, sir, for this podcast. And here we end with the inaugural episode of the season 2 of AI Now. I would request sir to just stay for just 2 minutes after the live session is over. And again, to the audience who have watched or who will watch in future, please like, share, and subscribe the channel. And please don't forget to click the bell icon. We will be there, and we will coming up with more episodes of AI Now and other podcasts on internationalism. So stay safe, never be the same, know the world beyond.